Today's Critical Issue Summit brought the 4 candidates for governor together to address how they're going to fund the infrastructure needs of the state when they're governor.
What groups are participating in this?
It's the Associated General Contractors, the Consulting Engineers Companies of Louisiana, the Architects Association of Louisiana, and the Asphalt Pavement Association. I'm Ken Nakan, CEO of Louisiana AGC, and on behalf of the Associated General Contractors, the American Institute of Architects of Louisiana, the American Consulting Engineers Companies of Louisiana, I hope I got that right, Dan, and Louisiana Asphalt Pavement Association, welcome to our 9th annual Construction Critical Issue Summit, which started out as we envision as an intimate discussion with the candidates for looking at infrastructure concerns for their term as governor, has turned into this.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate the opportunity, and I thank all of you for being here today. I'm John Bell Edwards. I've been in the State House of Representatives now for 7 years, wrapping up my 2nd term. For the last 5 years, I've been the chair of the Democratic Caucus in the House, and I obviously come from Tangipahoa Parish. I don't know if that's obvious to you or not, but I come from Tangipahoa Parish, where I'm married to my wife, Donna, for 26 years, who's a school teacher there in Tangipahoa Parish, and we've got 3 kids. Our middle child is actually going to be going with us next week to Washington, D.C. to be a princess, and so that's kept us a little bit busy the last few days, but been spending my time in the legislature I guess as the person who's most opposed to so many of the policies of Governor Jindal, many of which have resulted in a disinvestment in critical areas, such as education and health care, and, as you know, transportation infrastructure. And that's what we're here to talk about today, and I'm excited about that opportunity. So thank you again, Ken.
Thank you, John. Next, Senator David Vitta.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you and AGC for this forum, and even more importantly for all of your leadership on these crucial issues. About a year ago, Wendy and I really thought hard about my making this race, and we decided that I should. And fundamentally, I'm doing it to try to provide the leadership we need for all of us to come together as a team and face our critical challenges. I'm not running this race to kick the can down the road, to avoid the big issues or to play politics with them. And in that spirit, I said the day I announced my intention to run, this is going to be my last political job, elected or appointed, period. I'm going to try to lead starting now in this campaign, and 2 days ago in that spirit, I put out 2 significant policy proposals directly related to what we're talking about today. They should be in the form of a press release at your chair. I said the first thing I do out the box is have a special session about fundamental spending and tax reform, and that goes to the heart of what we're talking about today. And I also said sometime after that, I would develop and propose a critical highway spending plan tied to specific revenue to build critical need highway and infrastructure on an expedited basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Next, Lieutenant Governor Jay Darden.
I, too, want to thank all of you for being here and for the organizations that have put this forum together. It's the first one, so obviously it gets a lot more attention than some of the ones that are going to follow. I know many of you in the room and have worked with you closely over my time in public service. It started back on the City Council in the late 80s, where I authored the Architect and Engineer Selection Board process. It didn't exist in Baton Rouge at the time, and was a helter-skelter way of selecting professionals based more on politics and qualifications. And we changed that in this city. It won a national award. And so I developed a good relationship with many of you and many of your organizations. I spent 15 years in the Senate, sometimes on the inside, sometimes on the outside. I threw hand grenades over the wall at Governor Edwards during my first term in the legislature in '92. And then when Governor Foster became governor, I wound up chairing the Finance Committee and handling much of the legislation that he had proposed. You've given the opportunity to represent you statewide for the past 5 or 6 years or so. I spent 4 years as Secretary of State and currently am in my 5th year as lieutenant governor. And in those 2 positions, I've had the opportunity to lead from an executive standpoint, not only from legislative standpoint, but from an executive standpoint, managing budgets in difficult times, and doing so in a way that's produced nothing but success. We've had more people visiting Louisiana in the past 3 years than any time in our history, despite our budgets for tourism being slashed sometimes as much as almost a third. That's what Louisiana needs right now, is sensible, reasoned leadership and the ability not to divide people, but to bring people together, which is what I've tried to do during my time in public service. We are facing challenges now that are worse than we've seen before from budget years. We've had good years and we've had bad years, but as you'll hear during the course of this discussion, no doubt, and I think we'll probably agree on a lot of things, we need systemic changes in the way we approach our money in Louisiana. It starts with the state budget and it starts with the capital outlay program, and that's what it's going to take to truly prioritize expenditures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. And lastly, a Public Service Commissioner, Scott Angel. Scott?
Thank you, Ken, and I do want to join my colleagues up here in thanking you for providing the leadership and putting this together. You said it would be an intimate setting. If you get us any closer up here, you might as well put us all in one bed. I appreciate that. Again, thank you all so much. I'm so excited. The first time we get together as candidates is to discuss infrastructure with a heavy emphasis on transportation and buildings and whatnot. I say that because I think it's very important, and as the person with the most experience on the executive level actually fixing roads as a parish president, I get it and I understand it. Roads are not about just getting from point A to point B. They're about building an economy and building jobs, and I know firsthand what it does and what it can do. Again, as a parish president in a small parish, that didn't keep us from doing big things. We actually found a way to make things happen, and when we did that, we took a very small parish and took it to the 2nd fastest growing parish in Acadiana. It works when you invest in infrastructure. I'll do that. As I travel the state, I can tell you I've listened and I've learned, and the thing that I have learned the most is that people not only want a governor that's right on policy, they want a governor that's right on people. And I can tell you, I think today I am that person, again, from a small town and with a big family, the son of a conservative father who taught me education, who taught me the value of homework and teamwork, the son of a conservative mother, a God-fearing mother who gave birth to 9 kids and taught us the absolute value of life and the strength and gentleness of a woman's touch, you betcha. I was a brother to 8 siblings, I should say, where we shared a dysfunctional kitchen table every night, but we absolutely learned to respect the opinions of others as we gave ours. I certainly believe that that's what we need as a governor, someone who can work across lines and build Louisiana. I intend to be that person. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. And our vision of infrastructure, I'll say our vision, the construction industry, the design community, encompasses everything: state buildings, parks, roads, bridges, coastal, clean water, ports, and airports. So we will cover all those in our questions to the candidates. And let's start off with each candidate was given an individual question. We'll start off with Mr. Angel. And Scott, each one will give the individual questions. Each one will be able to answer in 10 minutes, and that leaves 5 minutes for if anybody else wants to chime in. Scott, and I'm going to call y'all by your first names because that's how I know y'all. There are many studies that warn of Louisiana's dire situation with coastal erosion, and particularly how they're going to affect the ports, the coastal ports. Louisiana's Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority has done a tremendous job sticking their fingers in the leaking dikes. No pun there. But to fully address our shrinking coastline, do you have any suggestions?
Thank you, Ken. You know, some say that we will never be able to fix our coast. I say we can, we are, and we will. I believe this generations of Louisianians understand the values, because the coast is not just about protection, it's about prosperity to me. So many of our people live in the coastal zone of Louisiana, and so many of our unique assets that we have, that we serve America with when it comes to fueling and feeding America, are in our coastal zone. So I get it and I understand it. And that's why I was a part of a generations of Louisianians that in 2005, after the storm season of 2005, said there had to be a better way. And before I tell you where we're going, I want to give you a second on where we've come from. Because prior to 2005, the way we approached coastal restoration and hurricane protection was in 2 different agencies, although it's really one effort. Because at the end, the barrier islands protect the wetlands protect the levees, and the levees protect the people. And I've noticed after the storm season of 2005 that we needed to do something radically different. And I gathered with folks across the state and introduced legislation, working with then Senator Reggie Dupre and Representatives Lulin Pete and other folks, and said, you know, what we need is a different approach. And we gave birth to the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority and gave it a laser focus to go do the things necessary to build and protect and restore coastal Louisiana. And now, as a result of that effort, the CPRA is recognized as one of the leading coastal agencies in America. And I would tell you that Sidney Coffey and Garrett Graves did a great job leading that agency since 2005. That was the first thing we did. The second thing we did, which I think is important, is that since 1987, I noticed that every governor, regardless of parties, and regardless if they were from North Louisiana or South Louisiana, they all spoke that if we ever got federal revenue sharing, that we would use it to restore our coast. Yet there was not a single statute or a single constitutional amendment that said that we would do that. You know more than anybody in the state that sometimes you have seen the transgressions that happen when we say one thing and we do something else with the money. I brought forth an idea that said we needed to have a constitutional amendment. In 2006, that constitutional amendment went in front of the people of Louisiana, and we created that trust fund. That was the second thing we did, to make sure that if we ever got any federal revenue sharing, we would make sure that we would deposit it in a fund and use it in a transparent, ethical, efficient, and effective manner. It's amazing that as soon as we did that, although the Congress had been talking about it for years, as soon as we did that, in the fall of 2006, by December of 2006, the federal government had approved the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act and said that they would share money with Louisiana that we would begin to receive in 2016. I certainly believe that it was those efforts that helped set the stage for the federal government to say in Louisiana they understand and we're sending that money there for a specific purpose. The third thing we did was form the Coastal Financing Corporation so that we would begin to find a way to bond the money that we would eventually get from the offshore revenue source. And of course, that takes timing, it takes pricing, it takes production. So my hope is that those three things will combine to give this generation of Louisianians the resolve to finish it. Now, obviously, we'll tell you that we all would agree the goal is sustainability, right? To be that group of Louisianians that go from losing more land to gaining more land, something that hasn't happened since 1930 when we took the Mississippi and the Chaffalay rivers and we contained them in their current path. But I am absolutely certain that with the fact that we have now a master plan, which is not perfect, but it has transparency in it, and it is the most robust one to date, and that robust master plan, which has to be approved annually by the Louisiana legislature after a variety of public hearings, will give us what we need, gives us the map to implement the projects, whether they be ridge restoration, barrier island protection, hurricane levee construction, all those things. So you ask perhaps, well, that's all fine and dandy, and you've kind of given us a history lesson in what you've done to be able to get us there. How are we going to pay for it? Got a variety of things that I think we can do. We certainly are going to be in a position here before too long to talk about bonding out some of the monies that we're going to get from offshore revenue after 2016, number one. Number two, the Restore Act has the promise of perhaps anywhere from $2 billion to $4 billion, of which Louisiana has said we will dedicate to coastal restoration and hurricane protection. Again, all in tune with that master plan. Number three, we have the Coastal Impact Assistance Program that I've worked with many of you to push money out to our parishes and local governments in a very, very effective way. And many of those projects are getting built now. And certainly, we have the opportunity occasionally when we have surplus money. I was happy to be working in 2007 and 8 when we had surplus money, again in 8 and 9, and put a variety of dollars into that effort. I would tell you that coastal restoration now is about, and hurricane protection is about show me the money, Jerry. It's the Jerry Maguire show, okay? What I really believe is that Louisiana has aligned itself from a governance standpoint. It has aligned itself from a transparency standpoint, and now it's a matter of using those dollars that are available and becoming available to implement a robust master plan that's based on best science and technology as opposed to politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Anyone want to add to that? Scott took very little time of his 10 minutes. David?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. 3 points real quick. First of all, I agree with Scott. We can restore the coast. I would add a third phrase, we must. I'm sure he agrees with that, because it's not some ancillary issue. It's a matter of core survival, pure and simple. Louisiana, as we know it, won't exist unless we succeed in this category. I mean, we're still losing a huge amount of land every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, a football field of land every 38 minutes to an hour. And of course, when we lose that buffer, that impacts people and communities. Every 3 miles of buffer land cuts down storm surge at least a foot. So this is about survival, point number one, and I know we all agree with that. Point number two, I think my experience in the Congress and the Senate on these issues is going to be tremendously helpful as I become governor. I've been the lead in our delegation on Corps of Engineers issues. Believe me, that's been not exactly a pleasure every step of the way, but a necessary fight, and it often is a fight. And I've had great help through the delegation and with great staff, including Garrett Graves before he came down to work here in the state. And so I bring that experience, and I think I'll be able to transition so that the delegation continues to do that work effectively, particularly with Garrett as a new member. We have done a lot in those efforts, including the revenue sharing bill Scott talked about. The whole delegation worked on that, led by Mary Landrieu, but I was very involved. And on the Corps of Engineers side, we authorized the Louisiana Coastal Area Plan through the WRDA bill. Doesn't happen, doesn't move forward unless we do that. We did that. We tremendously improved in lieu fee programs, and we're still making progress in that regard. We're making enormous progress, although we need to go further, in the beneficial use of dredge material across the coast, including in the Calcasieu plan. And so that experience, that work, I think will be enormously beneficial as I hopefully transition back to the state. Final comment, my immediate concern is that some of the big revenue opportunities we have coming our way for this, BP money, revenue sharing that we talked about, the Restore Act, could be stolen. It could be another big piggy bank that's robbed this year potentially to plug these budget holes. We need to absolutely prevent that, and I urge every legislator in office now to say, we're not going to do that. We're going to face our budget issues in a more responsible way. Because if we start pilfering those funds, if we start breaking those piggy banks, we'll never win the coastal battle. And that is a real, unfortunately, concern of mine and others this year. We need to say no. That's why I've proposed addressing those state budget revenue spending issues in a much more legitimate way, looking at all of these things in a special session immediately after I'm sworn in as governor.
Jay, you had something?
I don't remember what month, but in, I believe, 1930, National Geographic had a lengthy article about the new levee system that had been constructed in the wake of the flood of 1927. And it talked about, from a technical standpoint, how future Louisianians would figure out a way to make sure that they restored the dredge material or the alluvium that constantly is created by the overflow of the riverbanks in order to make sure that it didn't lose its coastline. We were warned as far back as then that something had to be done. We channeled the Mississippi River. We made our best effort to control Mother Nature, but in so doing, there was a recognition from an engineering standpoint even back then that we needed to do something to make sure that that river's materials were going to be made available to the southern part of Louisiana. It wasn't done. It's another one of the sagas of lost opportunities for Louisiana. But lo and behold, we've got opportunities once again. And the monies that are going to be coming from the federal government, from the variety of sources that have been mentioned, not the least of which is Go Mesa, which finally gives Louisiana its reasonable portion of federal dollars that we didn't get back then to be directed to this purpose. That fund, coupled with the BP money and the fines that are going to be coming, are going to be directed, and certainly would be directed under my administration, to this project. There is no greater threat to Louisiana than the loss of our coastline. It affects Shreveport, Shongaloo, and Chicago as much as it does Shack Bay and other places along the coast. This is America's wetland. This is not just the Louisiana coast. That's why I think the America's Wetland Foundation asked me to be involved on a national level on their initiatives. I chaired a program called Building Resilient Communities several years ago, where we spent a year going around the state, going to Texas, going to other Gulf Coast states to address the reality of coastal loss, most prominent in Louisiana, not nearly so much in our neighboring states, because the Mississippi River enters the Gulf of Mexico only through Louisiana, not through those other states. And we had a series of discussions, candid discussions, with probably some of you in this room at those meetings, all the different interest groups that have a view, whether you're an oyster fisherman, whether you're an oil company, whether you're a resident who lives in that area. Everybody sat around the table and talked about what we could do to save our coastline. We're not going to be able to restore every bit that we've lost. That's the reality. But we can do a lot with the money that's now being made available. We're going to have to reach consensus. We're going to have everybody recognize that they can't have everything that they want. And what I've done through my career is bring people together for the purpose of doing just that. And I'm hopeful and I believe that that can happen. We got to have the right leadership. We've got to recognize that those dollars have got to go for this purpose. They're not going to be redirected this year because they don't even exist yet. So they're not going to solve a great problem right now. But the legislature can, and the governor could right now, take the efforts needed in this session that's about to begin, which is a fiscal-only session. We got to have a special session. There's no question about that. That's not some big revelation. Next year is a general session. You can't deal with these matters unless you have a special session. Hopefully some of this is going to be addressed during this year. If not, it's certainly going to be addressed next year because we're going to be in a crisis mode from our financial situation. But we should never lose sight of the fact that the money that is going to become available out of the sky, and as a result of the unfortunate episode in the Gulf, we can direct to do what we can do to make sure we save Louisiana's coastline, Louisiana's wetland. I chaired another group for the America's Wetland Foundation with the governor of Illinois to talk about the Mississippi River. It was called the Big River Works, to focus on the river and all its manifestations in different states, and to develop a plan presented to Congress to make sure that we can all come together as states who have an interest in that river to make sure that it continues to be the economic engine of this nation as it was when Louisiana was founded centuries ago.
Thank you, Jay. John?
Thank you. I knew Jay was a few years older than me and well-read. I didn't know he was getting National Geographic in 1930. First of all, we cannot wait until January of 2016 to address our problems. We better do it in April, because in January 2016, if we have not, we're going to be figuring out how to open universities that have been closed, and the rest of them are going to be on life support. However, if we get to January 2016, and that's the situation, then absolutely a special session is in order, just like every governor in recent memory has had a special session in the first month of their first term. The fact of the matter is, coastal restoration, according to our own master plan, will require an investment of a minimum of $50 billion over 50 years, ideally $100 billion. And with Go Mesa and the Restore Act and the BP fines, we've identified a tiny fraction of that. And so it's important that we continue to work to identify sources of revenue to finance this plan. We have to have budget discipline, as David suggested, which we have been totally lacking in the state for the last several years. But we also have to make some better decisions locally. And quite honestly, I'm not sure that we're going to get the help that we might want from the federal government, and this is a national problem, given the role that Louisiana plays in the national economy. It is a national problem, but if we immunize the oil and gas companies that cause a certain percentage of that destruction, how do we then go to the national taxpayers and ask them to pay what those oil and gas companies perhaps should have paid? And that's why I was against the legislation last year to kill a pending lawsuit rather than allow it to go all the way through the process and have the courts to decide whether there was liability, and if so, apportion fault and damages. Because if we don't have the responsible parties paying, I don't know how it's fair to shift their percentage of fault onto taxpayers in Louisiana, much less around the country. So we have to make better decisions here locally as well.
Skylar, since you started this ball rolling, I'll give you 2 minutes to wrap up if you'd like.
Well, good. I think everyone obviously understands the significant importance of coastal Louisiana and what it means to not only Louisiana, but certainly all of America. Again, I would say that I had a opportunity. I took it and ran with it to make certain that we would organize ourselves in a way that would produce the kind of effective, efficient, and ethical responses that I know we all want. And, you know, if we go back in 2005, when we were recovering or responding to the storm event, when you talk about changing law that moves responsibility from one department to another, it's a lot easier to look back now and say, well, yeah, that was easy to do. It was very, very difficult to work with folks who did not want to really give up turf. But working again in a cooperative manner, you know, coastal restoration doesn't affect Republicans and Democrats and independents differently, it affects us all. And that kind of leadership is what brought forth a new idea and a new day. And I'm absolutely confident, had we not done that in 2005, we would not be poised to do the kind of things that we're talking about today.
Thank you, gentlemen. Y'all talk, in all y'all's discussion, y'all talk about diversion, so I'm gonna direct the next question to John Bell. And as the only current member on the panel in the legislature up on the stage, diversions from the Louisiana Trust Fund have increased year after year after year. We see state police this year at 69 million, paratransportation fund at 46 million. And that cuts dramatically into what is appropriated for ports and airports. How would you reinstill trust back in the trust fund with the populace, recognizing the budget woes that the state has, and any rediversion of a diversion of the funds would create holes in the budget?
Well, first of all, I think this is the most pressing thing facing the day-to-day operations of state government when it comes to transportation infrastructure. And I think it's an excellent question, but it's not just ports and airports and so forth. It's construction and maintenance dollars for roads and bridges as well. And the reason it's important to restore trust is I know that there are legislators such as Senator Adley and Representative St. Germain and others potentially looking at new sources of revenue that would flow into the Transportation Trust Fund. I think the likelihood of making that a reality before you restore the public trust in what we've already established is very, very remote. And one thing we can do is restore the integrity of that trust fund so that the money that we are paying into it from our fuel taxes primarily go towards the designated purpose. Now, I don't know that I like the word diversion because the TTF is in the Constitution, and if you're diverting money, then it sounds an awful lot like you're violating the Constitution. But the language allows for no less than 80% of those dollars to be spent to construct and maintain roads and bridges in the state and federal system, and then no more than 20% for the other purposes of flood control, ports, airports, and so forth. The big one there, and I think Ken may have mentioned this, is the $60 million currently flowing out of TTF for the state police for traffic control. As you all know, traffic control is not identified, I should say not defined, and therefore in some people's minds, I think that's where the greatest diversion of funding is. But up to 20%, and we don't violate that threshold currently. However, just because it's not illegal doesn't mean it's good policy. I believe that when people put gas in their gas tanks and they pay that 16-cent tax, 20 cents total to the state, but 16 cents to TTF, that they expect that that money is going to go to maintain and build new roads and bridges and not go to the state police. And so I think we need to honor that and find a way, and I'm going to detail that in just a moment, to move that $60 million out of the TTF and restore people's faith and confidence in that fund as a precondition to possibly getting any additional revenue further on. Secondly, I believe that it's important that we not use any of that 16 cents to pay for bonded indebtedness related to the Times program. Back in 1989, when people voted on this, this was two separate initiatives, and they never voted to spend any part of the 16 cents to finance the bonded indebtedness on the Time program. And as you know, the 4 cents only produces $120 million a year. But the indebtedness with respect to the Time program is 142. So you've got to find $22 million there to restore the integrity of the Transportation Trust Fund. So how would I do that? To get the state police out of the Transportation Trust Fund, and by the way, this is not an absolute Herculean task. They were getting $0 from the Transportation Trust Fund as recently as 2011. It's up to $60 million today. The Department of Public Safety has a $1 billion budget, so we're talking about 6%. So it's difficult, but it's doable. I would replace that $60 million into the budget. And you know, money is fungible. When you move it from one place, you got to put it somewhere else, and you got to find a way to plug that hole, because nobody's talking about cutting state police $60 million. But what I would do is save money on tax expenditures that, while they may be worthwhile, they're of lower priority, but save those expenditures, and with that savings, spend it on a higher priority, such as the Transportation Trust Fund. And we're going to have an excellent opportunities, because Dr. Richardson is doing an exhaustive study of all the tax expenditures on the books today, and whether they're costing too much and whether they're delivering what they promised. And we all know that there are many of them out there that are not. So that's what I would do with the $60 million. And by the way, what could you do with that $60 million? If that $60 million stayed in the Transportation Trust Fund, you could fully fund the preservation program for roads and bridges, because we are already paying $27 million, but we need $70. And with the additional money available with the $60, you could double the investment in our ports from $20 million to $40, which isn't nearly enough, but it's a good start. Anytime you can double your investment in our port facility. So I think that would be critically important as we move forward. The second thing I would do, in order to make sure that we're not using the 16 cents to pay towards the bonded indebtedness of the Time program, is I would allocate an additional 25% of the capital outlay program each year for the next 3 years to transportation spending, specifically the highway priority program. That's about $75 million each year, and $22 million of that could go towards the Time program to restore the integrity of the Transportation Trust Fund itself. I believe if we did those two things, those account for the primary transfers or diversions, as Ken mentioned, out of the Transportation Trust Fund. And if we did that, we would make a lot of progress toward restoring the faith and confidence of the people in Louisiana, their trust in that trust fund. We might set the stage for additional revenues at some point in the future to flow into that trust fund, but we would make critically needed investments in preservation of roads and bridges, as well as other things that we can do with respect to ports and everything that the Transportation Trust Fund pays for. So I would do those two things as a way to restore the trust in the Transportation Trust Fund. Because if we don't do that, we're going to miss the best opportunity we're going to have in our lifetime to really capitalize on the economic expansion going on in Louisiana. There are two things that these companies really need to sustain and actually amplify what they're doing for our state. They need trained, educated workers, and they need a transportation infrastructure so those workers can get to and from their jobs and not have to live right next door to their jobs. That's what they need. And in fact, they and the state of Louisiana would be better off if we spent more money on those efforts and less money on the financial incentives to try to get him to do to get them to come to Louisiana and do what the market is already incentivizing. We would all be better off. So that's why this is a critically important discussion today, and I really like the opportunity to answer this particular question. So thank you, Ken.
Thank you. And one day you're going to have to tell us how you got the name John Bell.
Ken?
Any other comments?
Yep.
Jay, I'm gonna let Jay go first.
Well, picking up
and
on...
I'm gonna give each y'all 2 minutes.
Picking up on John Bell's theme, we simply have to follow the law when it comes to it's not just the law, it's the Constitution as it relates to how monies are dispersed. 1 cent of gas tax is supposed to go to the Parish Transportation Fund, about $30 million. And in the past year or so, that number has been increased. Everybody likes to help the locals, and I understand that, but the Constitution says they ought to get 1 penny, so they shouldn't get more than that. That money could be redirected for this purpose. The Constitution says the state police gets the money for traffic control. I wouldn't argue that they should be shut out completely from being eligible for these funds, but it ought to be simply for traffic control, and the money that they're getting now certainly well exceeds that. The 2 savings that could be realized from those 2 simply following the Constitution provisions would generate some money that could be available more for preservation, which is, I think, the #1 priority of most people when they see where we are right now. Because we can do something about preservation if we simply move some of this money around to make sure that we set that as a top priority. And I'll have something more to say about this when we talk about the capital outlay issue.
David?
Yeah, Ken, let me agree with all the sentiment that's been expressed. It's absolutely correct, and this goes to the heart of what we're talking about today. You know, first of all, Transportation Trust Fund this year, $578 million, which, by the way, is less than 10 years ago, not even factoring in inflation. So not even in real dollars, but in nominal dollars, that's less than 10 years ago. But the bigger problem is what we're talking about, this diversion. If you look at real capital outlay for transportation, real new projects, it's about 6% of the Transportation Trust Fund expenditures this year. If you include any maintenance and overlay and anything that's sort of concrete and asphalt and steel related, it's still 19%, less than 20%. So that is a huge problem for 2 reasons that's been described. First of all, you're just not spending enough on infrastructure. But the second problem, as John Bell noted, is even more fundamental. It is completely destroying public trust in the Transportation Trust Fund. It is completely destroying that public trust, and you will never have an opportunity to have a more robust Transportation Trust Fund unless you restore that public trust. And so again, in the context of a special session on budget, spending, revenues, I've talked about 4 major areas to focus on, including the Transportation Trust Fund. So number 1, we need to look at all credits, exemptions, deductions, go over that with a fine-tooth comb. Number 2,
15 seconds.
Yeah, we need spending reform, including having more flexibility on the spending side outside the Transportation Trust Fund. Number 3, we need measures to promote growth. But number 4, we need to reinstill confidence and certainty in the Transportation Trust Fund so it's actually going to what people think they're paying for or want to be paying for. That also includes on the revenue side, making sure things like the vehicle sales tax actually get there rather than only get there in theory and never in practice.
That's a long 15 seconds.
Thank you, Ken.
Scott.
Sorry, it's my
No,
U.S. Senate
it's okay.
experience.
It almost was a
Senate time,
filibuster in
right?
the U.S. Senate there. But certainly everyone agrees that it is a diversion. It is improper when folks actually go to that gas pump and pay that not only 20, but 38 cents, probably the most taxed particular commodity in the history of Louisiana, 18 going to the feds and 20 coming here to Baton Rouge. They expected to go on the things that they were told they would go on. I disagree with Jay for just a second. I think the Constitution says up to a minimum of 1 cent instead of 1 cent. So whether we've gone over and we've given parishes the opportunity to spend more money, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because when you look at it, what we've done is we've put the shackles on our 64 parishes and our 303 or 305 municipalities, and we don't let them raise money for transportation infrastructure. We put so many shackles on our government and our local government in a method that says, come to Baton Rouge and beg for a crumb, and if you get one and you vote the right way, and we'll talk about capital outlay used as the bargaining chip, then you get a few things back home. So it is a diversion, and it requires that we call it what it is, and that we do what we say we were going to do, and we give people what they pay for. When it comes to the motor vehicle sales tax, the fact that we now collect 4 cents on automobile sales, and we bring that in, folks absolutely believe at the point of purchase that that money is going into fixing their roads. And now we've passed some bill in 2008 and set it to some trigger, some unreasonable trigger that has the general fund having to get to some 9 or 9.5 or $10 billion, which is unrealistic. 15 seconds, which is unrealistic. I think we need to call it what it is, and we all need to join together and put the trust back in the trust fund.
John, you want to close?
I do. And first of all, I think that's a good discussion. And Scott is right. It's not less than 1 penny of the 16 pennies. And of all those things combined, you can't spend more than 20% of the total transportation trust fund. So we're not giving them more than the law allows with respect to the parish transportation needs. The other thing is we do have to keep in mind that they do not have local optionability to do their own fuel tax. And so we got to keep that in mind. And I know that the minimum that they can get constitutionally is 30 million. They're currently getting 46 million. Given the needs that the locals have, I don't believe that particular diversion, as we've talked about it today, is our biggest problem, and I wouldn't advocate changing that. Now, everybody here says that we've got to restore trust in the Transportation Trust Fund. I just don't want anybody in here thinking that the Transportation Trust Fund is the only fund out there that's been raided over the last several years. Go ask somebody who depended upon the Officer Group Benefits fund balance to keep their premiums low and their out-of-pocket costs low. We squandered the Medicaid Trust Fund for the elderly on things that didn't have anything to do with the elderly. So we have got to restore budget discipline in the state of Louisiana, period.
Thank you, gentlemen. While we're on the state, talking about the state budget, let's talk a little bit about capital outlay bill. Jay, there's been much discussion regarding reevaluating the capital outlay bill in the process and the type of projects that are funded by it. State facilities such as universities, state buildings, parks, hospitals, et cetera, share the meager funding available in capital outlay with local projects. Do you see any restructuring of this capital outlay process? And we had a great lesson yesterday from Facility Planning Director Mark Moses on the capital outlay process. It's really the first time in 30-something years I've actually understood it. So,
well, then you need to explain it to all of us, because I don't know that anybody fully understands it. But to understand the capital outlay issue, you got to understand the budget problem to begin with. Our budget has been full of sleights of hand, almost a Ponzi scheme of moving monies around, moving one-time money around to serve recurring needs. I've always said we ought not use that one-time money to plug into a budget when you have recurring needs, because you become dependent upon something that's going away, and you're not going to be able to use it year after year after year. The capital outlay process of all things related to the budget cries out for change and cries out for reform. Our current system presumably provides funding on a priority basis. But let me go back just for a second. I hate to delve into this much minutia, but it's important to get the perspective of this. About 20 years or so, the state went to the IRS and wanted to get a ruling that the capital outlay program was a reimbursement program. And the IRS gave us that ruling, so that we then created a capital outlay escrow fund. So the capital outlay money technically goes into this capital outlay escrow fund. When bonds are sold or when there's any cash available, the money flows back into that escrow fund. And so projects are not necessarily tracked on a project-by-project basis. And last year in the Bond Commission, we, because of a concern about tax-exempt bonds, we had to go through an exercise to make sure we could track the expenditure of every dollar with every project that had been approved and had been spent upon. Now, the capital outlay bill has 5 priorities. Priority 1, you would think, is the number 1. That's going to go first. Well, what that is that provides cash for projects that are already underway. Priority 2, which is where a lot of people clamor and want to be into now, is new cash funding for a new or existing project. Priorities 3 and 4 are meaningless They haven't been funded since the 1980s, but legislators year after year after year introduce new projects to go into 3 and 4 so they can go give speeches at Rotary and Kiwanis that I got this bridge in the budget. I got something here. Priority 5 is the non-cash that's used for projects that take several years to complete. So we really need to re-identify what a capital outlay program is all about and create true priorities. In my view, and I was in the legislature for 15 years, the legislature has abdicated its authority to the governor to allow the governor to be able to pick out the projects that he wants to fund. That's the harsh reality of it, and the governor is then able to use that as a lever to get votes for whatever it is he wants. It's a carrot and stick, and it doesn't make for a true prioritization of capital outlay in Louisiana. I'm not sure the legislature is going to want to go through the process of setting real priorities and every year voting on what ought to be important and what ought to go first, what ought to be second, but the reality is the capital outlay process needs to be changed to move toward doing that. The establishment of real priorities as to how we spend money in Louisiana would be the most important thing we could do from a capital outlay standpoint. The transportation dollars that have come out of capital outlay are at a 5-year low right now. It's about 23%, I think, or something like that, of the amount of capital outlay that goes specifically toward highway programs. The concern that we're all expressing could be satisfied, at least in part, if we increase the amount of money in the capital outlay project that goes to highway construction. To do that would be very difficult, because right now, and again, the locals are strapped with monies that they can raise, but they have some basis of money, but they're constantly coming to the legislature for things to be funded. To be completely honest with the people, we have so many pressing needs at a statewide level that we can no longer afford to be perhaps as generous as we've been in the past in taking care of needs for nonprofits, needs for local government, which we all know are important, we all recognize. But the truth of a state budget is it's got to be for the priorities of the state, which ought to be public safety, healthcare, education, and transportation. And when you start trying to create too many priorities, you don't have enough money to take care of the ones that are really your main important ones, I think. And so we've kind of hit rock bottom, it seems to me, with where we are right now from a financial standpoint. We have rocked along for years and danced up and down with surpluses and deficits and been able to maintain the status quo, if you will, of the way we budget in Louisiana, the way we allocate capital outlay dollars. When we're now hitting rock bottom, as we've seen with where we are right now from a spending standpoint and where we are with projects that are already in the pipeline, it's time, it seems to me, to step back and say, if we're really going to create or really going to make transportation a priority, we've got to make it a priority in our capital outlay process. And that's going to be tough to do because people are dependent upon running to the Capitol, making sure they've got a governor that's friendly to them, letting their legislator get a project in the process and making it happen. And we don't have the financial wherewithal to do that any longer. So if we want to restore the trust of the people, we ought to be honest with them. And we ought to tell them this, and we ought to expose the way it's been done for quite some time and recognize that kind of when we've now hit the low point from a financial standpoint, we've got to rethink things. We've got to say we're going to set priorities and we're going to fund things from a priority standpoint, and we're going to demystify the capital outlay process, because we jokingly say nobody really fully understands it, and there's a lot of truth to that, because you don't always track individual projects and you don't always know where everything is, and when you get projects in the process, you can say it's not ready for the money yet, so we're not going to give it funding this year. We're going to give it to something else. You got to get in there and track it realistically and make certain that we're going to make transportation a priority, we're going to make our highways a priority, and we're going to do it within the funds that we've got right now. Freeing up the locals to raise money on their own is an idea we ought to think about. It creates the potential for local government, which governs best. And I agree, when I was on the Metropolitan Council, when Scott was president of his parish, that's where the rubber hits the road. You talk to constituents every day, you fix things, you make it happen. And so I think the more flexibility we give to local governments to take care of their needs and to set their own priorities, I think the better for government as a whole, and the better it will be for state government to recognize its priorities and fund them in a transparent, honest way with the people of the state.
Other comments?
Yeah.
Scotty?
Yeah, I agree with Jay. Certainly when you think of P1, P2, P3, P4, and P5, right? I remember as a young member of the St. Martin Parish Police Jury getting my legislator to fund me with a P3 project. I thought I was the greatest guy in the world. I had solved all the worlds. I came home, did a press release only to find out that it didn't mean anything, and they referred to it as a dead man's bucket. I'm not sure. So I was like, well, maybe next year, right? And then we got it on next year. It went kind of up, one of the priorities, but then it's, well, we didn't make the agenda for the bond commission. I'm like, well, why? Did we fill out the paperwork? No, we filled out the paperwork, but the governor didn't, through the commission of administration, didn't put it on the agenda. I'm like, well, I thought you indicated that you were for something that the governor was for, and as a result, this was going to happen. Yeah, but I think that happens way too much type deal. So the reality of it all is Jay's right. Even the people that wrote it don't really understand it. It's confusing by design. And even at the most senior levels in state government, folks don't really understand it. And we all know what happens when folks at the senior level don't understand it. It's very difficult to pass that information along. Jay's right, it's going to be tough to focus on the state priorities. But in order to get it done, you've got to unshackle local government. We don't expect here in Louisiana to depend on Washington to make us great. Let's not have the 64 parishes depend on the capital city to make them great. Let's give them the wherewithal to do what they need to do so we can make our job easier and focus on some of the bigger priorities in the state.
Thank you. John?
Thank you. I mentioned in my response a while ago that we should restructure capital outlay. I think we should spend an additional 25% of the capital outlay budget for 3 years on the state priority program. Now, I talked to you about the benefit that would give us to get the timed debt out of the 16 cents. Let me tell you something else that we could do. We could take part of that money, because it'd be $75 million a year, and we can replace those toll credits with hard cash so that we can actually fully fund a total of $100 million more each and every year, so that when we draw that match down, we actually have real dollars to put with it to fully fund those programs, and that would go a long way. In a budget that's only $750 million, you cannot afford, I should say, to lose $100 million of that because you don't have the hard cash. It would give you the hard cash to do that. And there is a cost to restructuring the capital outlay program. There would be some things that just wouldn't make it. But guess what? There are things every year that don't make it. There are things that are never, ever going to make it onto the bond commission agenda and get funded. But it is a matter of priorities. And there are many things that do actually get funded through capital outlay that have a very small benefit to some local area, but they don't benefit the state as a whole nearly to the degree that more infrastructure would. And quite often, too often, capital outlay is used as currency to go down and deal with legislators and get them to vote for something they don't really want to vote for. Now, I guess I'm particularly offended by that because my political relationship with this governor has never allowed me to have that opportunity to get a capital outlay project in exchange for a vote. But I happen to think it's bad practice. And to the extent that we redirected those dollars to transportation projects that would benefit the state as a whole, they wouldn't be available for those kind of shenanigans, and we'd all be better off.
David?
Yeah, 3 points real quick, and I agree with, I guess, all the sentiments expressed. Number one, we certainly have to make sure capital outlay is never used for recurring expenses and abused in that way. Number two, we do have to set real priorities and bring real discipline to it. And one of the biggest reasons is, as every contractor in this room knows, biggest factor in terms of the cost of a project is time, right? If you had all the money up front, it's going to cost a lot less than if it comes in dribs and drabs over 10 years. And so we have a capital outlay process that encourages things being built in dribs and drabs over several years, and that drives the cost through the roof. So that's very, very important. Third and finally, with regard to transportation, I wouldn't propose pushing all transportation out of the capital outlay process, but I think we need to be realistic. We're never going to make a big dent in that big category of transportation in the capital outlay process. And that's why 2 days ago I specifically said that during my first term, after that first special session sometime, I would develop and propose a specific highway infrastructure building program tied to specific revenue, get it done on an expedited basis. That would, by definition, be outside of the capital outlay process. You're never going to really take a chunk and solve our backlog with regard to transportation infrastructure through the capital outlay process.
Jay, you want to close?
I'd be curious to know what the revenue stream would be to be able to accomplish that. I mean, that's the question that really needs to be asked, is where, if we're going to do something like that, where's that money going to come from? And that debate goes on year after year after year as to whether you're going to raise revenue or whatever. One of the ideas that's been proposed by Senator Adley and Representative St. Germain, we need to think about. And this, too, is a difficult thing to accomplish politically, and it's a difficult thing to convince the public that it's the right thing to do for Louisiana. And that is now tied up in litigation, which makes it even more difficult to address, and that is the amount of money every year that flows into the rainy day fund. Because I was there when we created the rainy day fund. It was one of the best things I think we did to make sure that we had a relief valve when it started raining, and now it's obviously pouring and we have no access to that money. That's caught up in litigation right now as to what the legislature can do and how quickly it has to repay the dollars that are removed from the rainy day fund. But what I think is a valuable discussion to be had in the legislature is whether or not we ought to raise the threshold level in which we put money into that rainy day fund. If we raised it, for example, by $100 million and dedicated the money that was saved to transportation issues, boom, then we've got some money that we can address a one-time problem. This wouldn't be necessarily for ongoing maintenance in DOTD, but it would be to say we're going to take this one-time money and do one-time things to build roads, fix bridges, do what it is we have to do. And I think that discussion ought to take place because we have had a safe amount of money in the rainy day fund, particularly given the fact that it's been so difficult to access it. So I think that's one thing that we could look at as to how we would solve a problem to create some immediate funding to address what is, we all agree, clearly a pressing priority for the state.
Thank you, guys. The last individual question goes to Senator Vitter, and I'll tell you this question is kind of a softball for the senator, and it really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the governor, but he was kind enough to take the question and not call me back and said, I don't want to answer this. So he was kind enough to do it, but it has to do with the federal funding. And Senator, from your tenure as minority leader on the Senate Public Works Committee, we don't have to tell you about the funding situation on highways in Washington. Recognizing that the funding ceases this May, can you give us any insight on what's going to happen, may happen in Washington?
Absolutely, Ken. Thank you for the question. I was happy to take it. I'm happy to take it.
Kind of a softball for you.
Well, first of all, this is not at all outside my lane. This is in the middle of my lane because I've been for the last several years the lead Republican on the Senate Infrastructure Committee. And I'm proud to say my tenure there was marked not just by talk but by action, including bipartisan work and bipartisan cooperation. In fact, when I was the lead Republican, the Democratic chair was Barbara Boxer. We're just not from different ends of the political spectrum. We define the political spectrum in the United States Senate. We are the spectrum. And yet, on infrastructure issues, we work very effectively together on the committee. First thing we did right out the box was a water infrastructure bill, a WRDA bill, which was very successful in moving forward on crucial water infrastructure needs. That's extremely important for Louisiana as a port and maritime and trade state. And then after the WRDA bill, we worked with others, and just this December, we passed the last bit, which we couldn't pass in WRDA because it was outside our jurisdiction, which was a diesel tax increase for ships specifically on the inland waterway program, so that we're going to be doing a whole lot more of those projects. And we passed that just this December. Next thing we moved to on the committee was the highway bill that Ken is asking about. And again, we came together on a bipartisan basis and put together a longer-term highway bill, 5 years in Washington, that's ultra long-term, but a 5-year bill on a bipartisan basis, and passed it out of committee and teed it up on the Senate floor. Now, to be fair, we didn't have to attack the biggest issue, which is the funding issue, because it's outside the committee's jurisdiction. So we did the transportation policy issues, but we also participated in the discussion with the Finance Committee on the funding piece. That's the challenge, as Ken has said, right now. And I continue to work on that. And Ken's right, the deadline is May. The current highway program at the federal level essentially runs out of money in May. Now, we're going to go beyond May one way or the other, but my goal is not to just go beyond May with Band-Aids and hobble along as we have for the last several years, but get a truly medium to long-term bill. The good news is, in my experience up there, we've had a more serious bipartisan discussion about really doing that in the last 8 months than ever before. And it's involved Republicans and Democrats. Now, going from there to an actual bill is a leap, but still, that is the good news. And there are very serious proposals in that regard that we're considering and advancing, hopefully, for that May deadline. The three biggest financing categories are these. First of all, the traditional one, the gas tax. And I have said many times, and I'll say it again, I would support an increase in the gas tax if it is offset with another federal tax decrease, so middle-class families and lower middle-class families don't get a net tax hike, because we don't have a problem of federal taxes being too low. And if we do that on the income tax side or the withholding side, and we can, I would absolutely support that increase. Secondly, there are proposals with regard to tax reform and repatriation of foreign income. And you could pay for most of a 5-year bill with that, because that is significant revenue. And those proposals come from all parts of the political spectrum, including Rand Paul. And third, there are proposals about increasing domestic energy production and dedicating that revenue to the federal highway program. Now, obviously, that's problematic given the price of gas right now. It really needs to go up for that to have an impact, but that has been an important set of proposals, an important category. So I'll continue to work on the next highway bill. In the new Congress, I'm the chair of the Infrastructure Subcommittee of the Environment and Public Works Committee, and I'll continue to explore in a productive, aggressive way all of those possible funding sources.
Jay?
This is precisely why we want you to stay as the senior Republican on the Infrastructure Committee.
Good job.
That's it?
I'll take the compliment, but not the suggestion.
Scott?
I second the motion by Chairman Darden.
I think Senator Bitter makes an excellent point. We need to start funding our federal government in a more long-term, stable, predictable way. We need to have a transportation bill that allows for predictability going out into the future. Continuing resolutions just aren't the way to do business. Everybody has to know what's coming down the pike. And the adequacy of the federal funding is critically important, because most people that I talk to think that because of the austerity initiatives that we have starting, that the dollars just are going to be reduced to a point that elevates the importance of our discussion here today, that we deal better with these issues than we have been in the past at the state level. It's just critically important. And I do hope that we're able in Congress to work through this, fashion a long-term bill so that everybody can know what we've got coming, and then we can better plan and prepare and make changes here at the state level.
I just want to jump in and say to John, I'll agree. Certainly, in my mind, the most bipartisan issue, other than making sure that we are protecting the homeland, is infrastructure improvements. It's amazing to me that Washington, D.C. continues to fund that on a continuing resolution on a fire drill after fire drill after fire drill approach. When you stop and think of the amazing Eisenhower interstate system brought forth by that great president, we seem to have always in this country believed that those kind of improvements were among the best that we could make because they created jobs and they created economies. And somewhere along the way, the conversation kind of broke down and folks went in their own corners and quit working in a bipartisan way on that issue. So I'm excited that perhaps there is a new level of cooperation in Washington that the Senator's talking about today, and would urge him to be a part of that process, because I believe that transportation affects, again, Democrats, Republicans, independents, and people from all parties and all walks of life equally.
David, anything to close?
Yep, that's fine.
Thank you for that insight. Now we're going to ask some questions of all the candidates, and they will each get 5 minutes to respond. No rebuttals, just 5 minutes each. Louisiana's highway construction program topped off in fiscal year 2006-2007 at $1.9 billion. We ran about a 7-year average at about $1.2 billion. This year's budget, as recommended, the current year, fiscal year we're in right now, 14, is right around $750 million, quite a bit lower than that 7-year average. Next fiscal year, there's talk the state will use federal toll credits to match federal highway funds, which is not actually real money, dropping the program down to probably in the neighborhood of $650 million. There's no doubt we recognize the Department of Transportation needs more money for infrastructure improvements. What are your ideas? I'll start with Senator Vitter.
We'll never get to where we need to go. We'll never make it more robust unless we do that as step one. And as we said, you know, if you look at real capital outlay, new projects out of the trust fund, 6% of the so-called transportation trust fund. If you count all maintenance and any version of asphalt and concrete and steel, less than 20%. That's unacceptable. And the problem isn't just that you can siphon off 20% for completely unrelated purposes. That should be lower. But even within the 80%, there's stuff used for overhead, for retirement programs, for bureaucracies, for rich pension programs in some cases. So it's even, the problem is even within the 80%. Again, that would be one of 4 specific focuses I would have in an immediate special session focused on spending and tax reform. And again, the 4 would be, first of all, going through all the credits, exemptions, deductions in our state tax code with a fine-tooth comb, putting them under a microscope and testing them, real cost benefit. Number 2, spending reform, specifically ways that we can create more flexibility outside the Transportation Trust Fund to deal with the budget in down economies, so that, quite frankly, lots of folks can take a 0.5% haircut in tough years versus higher ed taking an 8% cut. Third, pro-growth measures that can significantly bring new jobs here, new jobs and new revenue. And fourth, what I'm talking about specifically focused on the Transportation Trust Fund. That involves both the spending side and the revenue side, as I said a few minutes ago. On the spending side, we need to make sure that's actually going to concrete, asphalt, and steel. That's what people want to pay for at the pump. And if that doesn't change, they will be completely closed-minded to any discussion down the road of making that fund more robust. And secondly, on the revenue side, Some things are supposed to be going into the Transportation Trust Fund. Problem is they never get there because of deficit triggers and everything else. Well, obviously, to solve that, you need to solve those deficit issues, which goes to the other tax and spending issues in the special session. But as part of that, you need to do away with those triggers so that those revenue streams actually reach the Transportation Trust Fund sooner rather than later. The most obvious example is the vehicle sales tax. That would be a huge and immediate focus of mine.
Thank you. Jay?
Well, that trigger would result in certainly a tax increase for the people, as they're paying more sales tax than what they're paying now. Even though it's on the books, it's not collected. I hope the legislature during this session, which is a fiscal session, is going to take a look at those exemptions and exclusions and credits. This is the year that they can do that, and this is the year that could provide some budget relief. The governor, I think, takes the misguided position that that's a tax increase if we do away with something that is not accomplishing the purpose for which it was enacted. And I think it's appropriate for a legislature to look at all these programs and say, are you doing what you're doing, or have you outlived your usefulness? They all have constituencies, big league constituencies. They all have lobbyists, seasoned, experienced lobbyists. They all have an agenda, and some of them remain good. And we'll talk about the motion picture tax credit. We'll talk about the enterprise zone. Talk about all these costly exclusions and exemptions. And in a time of crisis, and I think this is a time of crisis, now is the time to look at that and say, can this give us some relief? It's going to take a little time to get to where that would be providing some relief. I don't know how instantaneous it'll be for this budget year, but I think if the legislature would act aggressively now in a session where they're supposed to focus only on that. They only have a handful of bills that they can each file that don't have anything to do with fiscal matters, so they can spend the entire time that they're in Baton Rouge focused on what is a critical problem that everyone in this room recognizes. And that could provide some immediate relief to all the monetary discussions we're having about improving our infrastructure, increasing funding for transportation, for the highway program. I think we all touched on some of these areas where we can get some immediate relief. Focusing on state projects, not allowing money as much as it is to go to the state police. Some of the things in the short term that can be done to free up some money that in turn could be dedicated. And I think that's the discussion that's got to take place. If it does not take place, and it may not, because this is an election year, and though many of the legislators, including the two chairmen of the transportation committees, are term limited and therefore free to say what they really think, a lot of other people are going to be standing for re-election this fall, and they just as soon kick it down the road. If they kick it down the road, I hope to be standing in the middle of the road to pick up the can and make certain that we waste no more time in addressing the kind of problems we're talking about today, and being honest with the people of Louisiana and making sure we move in the direction we all want to see this state move.
Scott?
Thank you. Certainly, I think all of us would agree that in one sense we've traded one set of problems for another. Prior to 2005, our economy was flat, and we were struggling to bring industry to this state. In fact, if you remember, prior to 2005, the one big win we had was Union Tank Car Company in Alexandria. And things were pretty flat prior to that. Then we began to trade, I believe, one set of problems for another by certainly inviting folks and giving away some of our state revenue to be able to get folks. And that's an appropriate use of money when we get what we pay for. And I certainly appreciate the legislature, along with Dr. James Richardson, looking at that and coming up with a list of those things that we are not getting what we pay for. That's the first thing we ought to do. Certainly everybody would agree. But we need to go beyond the immediate relief that Jay's talking about, and I certainly believe there will be some immediate relief. We need to go past that. We need to introduce fiscal note reform. I can tell you the way the process works right now. A legislator introduces a bill. It gets referred to some committee, and a group of very few smart people are now drinking from a fire hose with all of the different bills that are introduced, and they have to give an opinion to the board of directors of the state of Louisiana on what does this cost? What will this cost the state of Louisiana? And I assure you, it's like the weatherman. It's almost always wrong. And we never go back and look at it and say, you know, this was, we didn't put a cap on it. We didn't have it tied to something that really made sense. They doing the best they can. You know, when you introduce a retirement bill, will require in the state of Louisiana that you pre-file it ahead of time, that makes sense. We do that for the purpose of giving the actuarial scientists the time to scrub it and to then bring to the board of directors what it actually means. When it comes to tax exemptions, tax credits, even raising taxes, we ought to make absolutely certain that we have some kind of pre-filing deadline and we get folks involved in that process, and we don't just forecast nilly-willy and come up with something that ends up perhaps thinking would cost us $10 million and ends up then costing us $50 million. So not only do we need to do it in the short term, but we need to have the courage and the strength to do it in the long term. You know, next year I understand we perhaps will have 2 million non-farm employees in the state of Louisiana for the first time. Many of them in our metropolitan areas. And again, I believe that workforce development is the #1 challenge to growing our economy. And I would tell you, I believe #2 is our transportation issues. I believe there are times when Wall Street will be looking at Louisiana and want to be a part of us and would say, I'm not so sure that I want to be there because of those transportation issues. We can give local governments an opportunity to raise their own revenue by taking the shackles off of them and trust them as much as we want Washington to be able to trust the 50 states. I think we can do that. There's no question about it. In St. Martin Parish, we did something revolutionary. We did something revolutionary. The voters approved a sales tax for roads. It's only on roads, and we have a provision in the ballot proposition. The Supreme Court recognizes that ballot proposition is the highest ranking language that they interpret. We put a provision on the ballot. I fought with the bonding attorney on this language. Provided, however, none of the funds will be used for employees or fringe benefits. We don't need to build another bureaucracy. We don't need to provide for retirement benefits. We need the money that's collected to go actually where the rubber meets the road. And those are the kind of things that I believe I can do and will do along with the capital outlay reform. Thank you.
John Bell.
With the capital outlay changes that I mentioned a while ago, if we dedicated 25% more to the Transportation Trust Fund, that would be a total of $75 million, a portion of which, $16 million, would replace those toll credits, which are not real money and which were part of the question, and solve that problem so that we don't drop down from $750 to $650 million in the total program this year. Critically important. But, you know, we've had this word reform thrown around a lot here today, and certainly over the last 7 years. Reform as a word doesn't mean much, because the truth is we've reformed ourselves into dysfunction in Louisiana in many, many ways. And so when somebody throws out reform, you got to decide for yourself whether what the proposal that they're setting forth really means an improvement. Now, we've got to wean the state police out of the Transportation Trust Fund. And that, along with the capital outlay changes I talked about, that's $135 million more every year. That is meaningful money, given the circumstances of today, and that is absolutely doable. It is going to take a hard look at all the tax expenditures. And I agree with Jay. These are expenditures. And these are not tax cuts that are being reversed. In fact, in many of these cases, people are entitled to these benefits if they don't even have a tax liability. And we cannot farm out our decision-making as to whether we're going to take a look at them to people like Grover Norquist and others outside of this state, so that we lose all sense of common sense and reasonableness here. And one of the things I have always agreed upon, and this comes from my conservative friends, is that you don't raise revenue by raising tax rates, you raise revenue by growing the economy. Well, we've been told in Louisiana for several years now that we're growing the economy better than the national average, certainly better than the South. We've got all this job creation, economic development, but we don't have net new revenue to show for it and with which to fund our priorities. We've got to do something about that. If you've got all this growth without net new revenue, then you're incentivizing that growth to the point where you cannot maintain your commitments to these higher priority items. And we've got to take a look at that. And it's going to take very serious leadership that's able to forge a bipartisan consensus on these issues, because every single tax expenditure, whether it's a lower priority item or not for the state, it has a built-in constituency. And I promise you, come April, when we start looking at these things, it is going to be the lobbyist full employment time. Everybody is going to be at the Capitol fighting to preserve everything that they've got. And that's why you need leadership at the top. And I hope the Speaker and the President of the Senate and others can lead in this fashion, because as of right now, there's no indication it's going to come from our governor. I think it has to come from the governor to have a chance to be successful, and that's what I look forward to doing as your next governor.
Thank you, gentlemen. By the way, I just got an alert from the state capitol that state police, with all the talk about state police, they have dispatched 10 troopers to be traffic control from Bluebonnet to Interstate. So lose your name tags when y'all leave here. The last question is for all the candidates. Louisiana is on the cusp of possibly a $900 billion industrial expansion from Lake Charles through Baton Rouge down the river to New Orleans. Even in central and northwest Louisiana, they're talking about plants and facilities up there. We all know there's a worker shortage in the state. There's no doubt about that. I believe, truthfully, that we will get around that. What we're talking about, when we talk to the industrial sector, the one thing that gives them concern and that is not being addressed is the lack of infrastructure to handle the increase in the workers, the materials, the finished products, et cetera, et cetera. If you travel anywhere in South Louisiana at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when a plant's let out, you know we got a traffic problem today. Calcasieu River, a bridge, and Lake Charles on I-10. Gentlemen, any thoughts on how we fund these unfunded, needed infrastructure expansions to keep this industrial expansion coming to Louisiana and not to Texas? Because I'm going to tell you, Texas is still hammering on these guys to come over to their state, where they have put $3 billion into infrastructure improvements to attract these industrial plants. Any thoughts on developing a program and how do we fund it? Yeah. I'll start off with Jay. You first up?
Well, first of all, one of the things that we've gotten right during this administration has been the Workforce Initiative and the Workforce Investment Group that meets regularly and brings everybody together, to my knowledge, for the first time to talk to each other. Four-year universities, community colleges, the private sector, to talk about what we can do to develop the workforce that we all talk about. We know that all these great jobs are coming. Really, the campaign rhetoric won't center around creating jobs. Those jobs have been created now as a result of the commitments that we have from people to come to Louisiana. We've got to make sure that our citizens, our Louisianians, our young people have the right tools and skills to be able to satisfy the needs of industry. And we're not there yet, but we're certainly getting there. And I think credit goes to those who have recognized this and had the vision to make sure we prepare ourselves to have our young people properly trained, getting two-year certifications, getting particular training outside the scope of traditional education to handle the job. So I make that point because I think that has been done very, very well over the course of the past couple of years. This particular question begs a discussion about how we can do a better job in our economic development efforts to make sure that those companies who are coming, who we know are going to need infrastructure, partner in that effort. We want to do everything we can to incentivize companies to want to come to Louisiana, and we've got a huge economic development budget to do that. We've got a mega fund, we've got other things that have been created, and they obviously have had some success with the announcements that have been forthcoming about construction, particularly in the Lake Charles-Lafayette corridor. And I was there earlier this week, and one of the concerns constantly expressed was just this. What are we going to do about the infrastructure? What are we going to do to take care of all these folks that are going to be coming and that are already here? And so I think we have to have the discussion about how the economic development incentives also include a discussion about infrastructure, and that we want you to come, but we've also got to be cognizant of the increased traffic you're going to put on the roadway, the expectations you have to get workers to and from your plants, and what you can do to export your product once it's produced. And this is kind of the combination of a lot of things we talk about in transportation. But the reason that so many people are here is because they recognize the incredible transportation fundamentals that exist in Louisiana right now, from rail and from our port system and from the Mississippi River, and we have to make sure the highways are at the same level that those are. And so I think discussions with economic development, how some of that money can develop to public-private partnerships in a much more aggressive way, where the private sector, particularly those who are benefiting from the incentives we're giving them, are going to participate in the infrastructure needs, because they're new needs. We're not talking about preservation now. We're talking about new needs, upgrades that may be necessary to accommodate this new economy, and I think they need to be at the table. And frankly, I think economic development, that department needs to be at the table with the, relatively speaking, huge amount of money that has gone into that department compared to other departments of state government.
Scott?
Yeah, one of the things I would recognize is that for perhaps the last 25 years, we have built an economy or had an economy that was based on the price of oil, the commodity of oil, something that none of us has a control over. And as things were good, we found a way to pump $1 or $2 into transportation and to give school teachers a raise here. I think things are beginning to change. I think things are moving from not so much an E&P state, an exploration and production state, but actually to a manufacturing state, a state that is actually not going to be based on the high price of oil, but actually the affordable price of natural gas. And I believe we have an incredible advantage, and we need to take care of that advantage and not lose it to Texas by making sure we invest in our infrastructure. I believe when we take a look at certainly the Calcasieu and the Mississippi River corridors, we are on the verge of repeating what Governor John McKeithen did in the 60s with regards to manufacturing. And obviously when you have manufacturing, jobs come to a central spot as opposed to exploration and production where you go through a variety of different locations. That creates traffic issues. That creates infrastructure needs. We need to understand it. Here in Baton Rouge, I certainly saw the article yesterday with regards to tolling opportunities. I believe that there is an opportunity for us to embrace public-private partnerships on tolls to make sure that we can give folks an opportunity to take another route to get from point A to point B and to pay a nickel for it. I know when I go to Texas and Dallas or I go to Destin in Florida, I'm happy to pay that toll to get out of the traffic and to give me an alternative. But also in those areas, you have the right to take the old road. So we have a duty and an obligation to give folks what they paid for and to give them an option, perhaps, to take a road that is perhaps a little bit safer, perhaps a little bit more convenient, and certainly gets rid of the frustration. You know, all those kind of things require a governor who doesn't say no, who says, I'm willing to cooperate and collaborate and engage with the board of directors of the legislature. The governor can't pass a bill if he can't work with legislators. I believe I have the skill set to do that. I've demonstrated working across party lines and playing for the name on the front of the jersey, Louisiana, as opposed to the name on the back of the jersey. Thank you.
David?
Thank you, Ken. Well, certainly, first of all, I agree with the premise of the question. I think we're at a new stage of economic development challenges in Louisiana. It's not so much about targeted incentives as it has been in past years. It's about capacity to support this stuff, capacity to support what's already coming, hopefully capacity to induce more and support that. And the two big capacity categories are skills training, and we've made big improvements in skills training, but we need to basically triple what we're doing very quickly. And secondly, transportation infrastructure, what we're talking about. That's a huge capacity issue which goes straight to economic development, supporting what's already coming and getting more, just as Ken, you suggested. I think the other part of the new stage of economic development is overall business climate. I think it's generally very good in Louisiana, the best in my lifetime. I'm 53, but there's one big exception to the rule that I would attack. I don't think anyone else up here would, quite frankly, but I would attack it, and that's the litigation environment, attacking frivolous lawsuits, and that absolutely keeps businesses and jobs out of Louisiana. Now, in terms of that transportation need, in terms of critical projects, that goes directly to the second major policy proposal I made 2 days ago. And I said specifically that after that first special session sometime during the first term, I would work with others, you, community leaders, the legislature, to develop and propose a highway and transportation building program, high priority projects tied to specific revenue, get it done on an expedited basis as quickly as possible. Now, are all the details of that worked out? Of course not. First of all, we need that special session about general spending and tax reform ideas. Secondly, the way you get there is to work with a broad array of folks, all of you, folks in the industry, community leaders around the state, the entire state legislature, to see where we are and what we can propose. And also, it goes back to that first step that's critical. This will be a non-starter with the public unless we've restored trust in the Transportation Trust Fund first. We need to do that first. We need to regain trust. We need to regain confidence, and then put a proposal before citizens, matching high-priority projects, things that will make a difference to Baton Rouge congestion, things that will make a difference getting folks from West Baton Rouge over back to East Baton Rouge at the end of the workday, things that will make a difference in Lafayette, which is more and more congested every day, tied to specific revenue, and tell voters this is what you would pay, and this is where it comes from, and this is what you would get. And it's up to you. And so that's what I would specifically do after we set the table first with overall spending and tax reform, including restoring real trust in the Transportation Trust Fund.
John Bell.
Thank you, Ken, and I'm not sure that there's another exchange coming today, so I want to thank you and all the folks here again and all the folks on the
Well, we
panel.
can give you a chance to close and do
Okay,
accolades.
very good. I didn't know about that part of the format. But the question that was given to us in advance talked about the price of oil and how that is exacerbating our budget problems and what we would do to fund currently unmet major needs for the state of Louisiana that don't seem to be on anybody's radar. Well, the fact of the matter is these things have been on my radar for quite a while. And that's why I have not been able to vote for the budget in 2 of the last 3 years, because we have been in budget chaos without any discipline, where there's no effort to match recurring dollars to recurring expenditures, and we're borrowing and raiding and everything we can to act like everything is okay. Now, I did vote for the one in 13-14 because the conference committee that took place that year on the appropriations bill actually took control of the appropriations bill. And we made changes, and yeah, there were cuts. But at the end of the day, we had the first appropriations bill that didn't result in a mid-year cut. And in the process, we increased the MFP for the first time since 2008, and I led that effort. The governor didn't ask for those dollars. And more importantly for the people in this room, we put $36 million into the districts out there for DOTD to pay for maintenance needs, $4 million per district. The governor didn't ask for those dollars either. But we were able to do those things and result in no mid-year budget cuts for the first time since 2008. So I know how to lead a bipartisan consensus on these issues. I know how to get things done in a responsible way. Now, Jay talked about workforce development initiatives, and there's been a lot of talk about that. And it's good, we have to talk about it, but the truth is you fund your priorities. Don't listen to what people say their priorities are, look at what gets funded. And the fact of the matter is we've cut $700 million of state support out of higher education, which includes our universities and our technical and community colleges. Now, there's not a workforce development initiative that you can think of that benefits from that level of a reduction in funding. And oh, by the way, we're looking at as much as $300 million more being cut from that in the year coming up. Now, I'm hopeful that the legislature will rise up finally and say, no, we're not going to do that. But that's what we're looking at today. With respect to tolls, the fact of the matter is there's not a stretch of road in Louisiana where tolls are feasible. Because the volume of traffic just won't support it without the toll being so high that it's just not feasible. I don't believe that people going on I-49 from Morgan City to New Orleans ought to have to pay $27 one way, and that's what the study comes back at. Now, we can look at tolls for specific projects such as bridges, and I know Ken mentioned the I-10 bridge at Lake Charles. That would be a perfect candidate for a toll in my estimation. But we can do better in Louisiana. There's no doubt in my mind it's going to take hard work. It's going to take someone who's got common sense and intelligence and who wants to be reasonable in the way that we fund things in Louisiana and not so ideologically rigid that they continue to ignore everything, every alternative that is available so that we can move the state forward.
Thank you, gentlemen. Everybody take a deep breath. We'll give y'all 5 minutes to close. I'll start off with Jay.
Well, thanks, Ken.
And you can talk about whatever you'd like.
Thank you all very much for hosting this forum, and thank all of you for being here and showing the interest that you have. The campaign really kind of kicks off today. The gun goes off. It's been out there for a while, but the opportunity for all of us to appear together today really kind of signals the beginning. And even leading up to this, the most frequently asked question I get traveling around the state, and I travel around the state an awful lot, and the nature of my job is, why in the world do you want to do that? And that's a general reaction that people have right now. Why would anybody want to take on the problems that the next administration, the next legislature, the next governor is going to face? And the answer is very simple. I love Louisiana. I've spent about 20-some-odd years in public service with a record that I hope and I believe has shown my love and my passion for this state and my ability to listen more than I talk and my ability to bring people together for the purpose of solving problems, sometimes that seem insurmountable. I remember when I was on the council, and I go back to that because I think service at the local level is perhaps the most important level of service. You're closest to the people. And we had a bad flood in Baton Rouge, and a lot of houses flooded, and everybody was all upset. It was in my district for the most part, and I said, you know what, we need a flood damage prevention ordinance in this city. And everybody said, oh, we can't do that. And the developers were all up in arms. The engineers said you couldn't do it, and the hydrologists didn't know what we were thinking about. And I had a series of meetings at 7 o'clock in the morning for about 2 months and brought everybody together, made them get up and come to that meeting. We sat around the table, and we talked about how we could do this. And the result was the East Baton Rouge Parish Flood Damage Prevention Ordinance. Since that ordinance has been in place, not a single house in Baton Rouge, new construction, has flooded. That's fixing things. And when you talk to people and when you listen and you're not so rigid as to think you know everything, because I'm not the smartest guy in the room, you can make great things happen. That's what Louisiana needs right now in its leadership, and that's what it needs in the governor's mansion. Someone who has made a career out of bringing people together, solving problems, and having a reputation for doing the right thing for the right reason, politics notwithstanding. I've never been the greatest of all politicians, and I admit that, and I recognize that as I go into the ultimate political battle in Louisiana. But I hope that when people look at the four of us and look at our body of work, our reputation for integrity, our consistency in the manner in which we address problems, and you evaluate all of us, you'll say, given Louisiana's predicaments, given its challenges, given where we want it to go in the future, Jay Darden is the guy that I think can make that happen. And I ask you for your support, and I ask you for your consideration, and I'm very grateful to all of you for being so concerned and so interested about where we are. I know your interest and your passion clearly is focused, laser focused on transportation and on what we need to do to improve funding to get our roads the way we want it. But you also have a passion for this state and a love for this state in a greater sense. And I look forward to the day when I can be in that governor's mansion, take your calls, respond to your needs, and move Louisiana in the direction we want it to go. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jay. John Bell?
Thank you. And now is my time, I guess, to thank all of you for being here and to the panel. This is the first time that the four of us have had an opportunity to be in the same place at the same time. And I've enjoyed the dialogue, the discussion, the back and forth, and I appreciate the fact that it has been very civil, and hopefully it has been informative for you and beneficial. We've got to put Louisiana first again. It's just that simple. We cannot afford at these times to continue to have a governor who does anything other than that. We cannot further party. We cannot further DC-style politics. We can't further our own personal political ambition. We've got to get up each and every day and work on behalf of the people of Louisiana. That's what I promise to do, is to put the people of Louisiana first. I have a record in the legislature. I'm not going to run from it. I'm not going to hide from it. I'm quite proud of it. And if you've got any questions for me, I invite you to contact me. If I can do anything for you, I'd ask you to do the same. But I look forward to a very spirited, good debate as we move forward with this election over the rest of the year. And I think we are at a very critical time, where more than at any time in my lifetime, I believe, or at least since I've been old enough to pay attention, we need to elect a governor with a vision for this state, with a real compassion for its people, a love for the people of Louisiana. And I know that I have that. And I'm asking for your support. And so when you ask that question about what these times need in the governor's office, I'm asking you to conclude a little differently than Jay did, or that Scott might, or that Senator Vitter might, and that you look at John Bell Edwards and work with me together. We will fix a lot of these problems. And please don't think that the only problems we have in Louisiana today relate to transportation infrastructure. We've got a multitude of problems, and they're all interrelated. And if you fix something over here, there's a chance you've messed it up over here. And so we have to have somebody who will look at it all, not take things off the table prematurely, but actually do what's best for the entire state of Louisiana. That's what I promise to do, and I ask for your help.
Thank you, John Bell. Scott?
Thank you. I want to certainly thank all of you for being here on this day that the sun has finally come out after 5 or 6 days of cloudiness. And if Ken, if you would have known that getting the 4 candidates for governor would make the sunshine in Baton Rouge, you could have done it. Now, I hope all of you leave before I do, so you get nailed by those state police before I do. And let the record show that I am absolutely for good state troopers, right? Having said that, I too love Louisiana, like my colleagues, and I certainly want to congratulate my 3 colleagues up here for having the courage and for working with their families to get to this point in their careers. It takes a lot to be able to run for public office. It comes at tremendous sacrifice to your family, but it's fun. It's a great state. I believe our best days ahead of us, and I want to be a part of that equation. I want to have my hands on the steering wheel to make sure that we, I think, develop the great things that we can. You know, I believe that no one has a monopoly on great ideas, that it does take this collaboration and this cooperation from a variety of folks. My career is documented in that way more than anybody up here, in my opinion. Getting appointed by a Democratic governor, getting reappointed by a Republican governor, working in a variety of ways to make Louisiana better, and again, always playing for the name on the front of the jersey, Louisiana. I really believe I've done that. And while we've had, I think, a good run and a good career, I certainly want to try and dedicate myself over these next several years to building a better Louisiana. We don't need a philosophy in the governor's office. We need an executor, somebody who's going to get up every day and go to work. Again, my family has prepared me for that as one of 9 kids and a father of 5. And while I'm very proud of the things I've done professionally, the 2 most important jobs that I have, to be the husband of Diane and the father of Zach, Alexandra, Simone, Jean-Paul, and Marissa. Thank you very much.
David?
Thank you, Ken. I want to join everybody up here in thanking you and AGC for this forum. It was a great opportunity to talk about it.
Let me add, it's also the engineers, the architects.
Sorry. Didn't mean to get you in trouble. And I want to thank my colleagues up here. These 3 men are genuinely good people and solid leaders, and I appreciate their putting themselves out. And I'm honored to be with them and with all of you talking about this stuff. As I said at the beginning, when Wendy and I decided on this race, we thought long and hard about it. Ultimately, we were both really excited about meeting these challenges we're talking about and others, and taking advantage of the opportunities we have in Louisiana, because we do have great opportunities if we get through these challenges by meeting them head on. And that's why I said the day I announced my intention to run that this was going to be my last political job, elected or appointed, period. Now, that doesn't mean I won't make mistakes. It does mean I'll be focused like a laser beam on doing right for Louisiana and all of its people, from our best and brightest to our most vulnerable. That I'll be focused like a laser beam on taking on those big challenges, not avoiding them, not playing politics with them, not thinking about what sells in Iowa or New Hampshire, not kicking the can down the road. And I absolutely commit to that. And that's why I started relatively early, so I would have all of last year to do my homework, to be prepared substantively. One thing I did in that regard is host 5 leadership forums around the state last year. I'm doing 7 more in the first 3 months of this year. And one of those last year was specifically focused on highways and infrastructure and traffic relief. I want to thank Ken and lots of folks in this room for being a critical part of that positive discussion September 3rd in Baton Rouge. That's the approach I'm going to take governing. I'm not the smartest person in the room either. There are plenty smarter, and Ken told me he is, but there are others too that rank between him and us. I'm going to reach out to folks who are experts in their fields like you on this issue, and to leading citizens all around the state, and to all state legislators. I'm going to build that team to face those challenges and get the job done.
Thank you, David. I want to acknowledge someone. Looked off to my right over here, and good friend of AGC, current Jefferson Parish President and candidate for Lieutenant Governor, John Young. John, thank you for being here. And gentlemen, thank you. Thank you for stepping out of your lives and running for this most auspicious office. It's not a job that's going to be easy the next 4 years. Y'all know what y'all got ahead of you. And remember, when you're elected governor, you kicked off your campaign right here at the 2015 Critical Issue Summit, and we will have that person back as our keynote speaker at our 2016 Critical Issue Summit. I want y'all to make that commitment to us.
Got it.
Done. Yes, sir.
Thank y'all. I'm encouraged that all 4 candidates recognize that we need infrastructure funding coming up in the next 4 years. What I'm most encouraged about is that they recognize that with this industrial expansion, we're going to need to address some of these major Louisiana thoroughfares to get the goods, the services, the people in and out of these plant expansions.